So this week we're going to be talking about infant and toddler development, plunging right into the first couple years of life. We'll talk about attachments, cognitive development, and a little bit of physical development in these first few years. We'll start with infancy, and then I'll probably do a second video that's mostly toddlerhood. All right. So, first thing to know about infants that you at some level already know, of course, but as a good reminder, is that our proportions change dramatically. So, if we're talking about how difficult it is for an infant to begin to move around the world in terms of crawling or walking, gotta consider the fact that when we are born, our head is a quarter of the length of our entire body. We are born with our heads 70% the size that they will be as an adult. That is a lot to freaking balance. So if kids are having trouble moving about or crawling, walking, this may be because, at least in part, of proportions. And this is a problem that all kids deal with. On the other hand, I like to share the story of a friend of mine who had a kiddo that was a little bit delayed in crawling. And she was very concerned about this. This was her first child. And she went to the doctor and came back from the doctor and said, "Yeah, I'm so excited. The doctor says it's okay and he's not worried about it. My kid is in the 25th percentile for overall weight, but she's in the 98th percentile for diameter of her head." That's why she's not crawling, because she had a big head. And of course, this child has grown into her head and it looks like a normal and is a functioning adult now. But our proportions, particularly depending on where we are in terms of where we fit with averages at that age, may affect our mobility. All right. So, speaking of physical development in the beginning of life, this is both for prenatal as well as in the first year. Um, our development proceeds in two major trends. And my point here in giving you this terminology is not that I think these are words that you should commit to memory and know forever and ever because you're going to use this in your clinical practice. Nope. But it is a idea that kind of there is a governing perhaps logic to the way that our early physical and cognitive development kind of proceeds, right? So the first trend is cephalocaudal. This is from the head to the tail is what the roots of that word come from. So head down, and then the other is proximal distal, so close to far. And this is from the center of our body outwards. So if a kid is born premature, they're likely to have more of that final development, more intricate developments, nuanced development completed in the brain than in the toes, in the internal organs, again, than in fingers or toes. So it is, if you were trying to figure out how to make a human and make a human that would survive outside of the womb, this would be a pretty good way to do it. So these are two major trends for early development. Okay, some other things to think about with infants is how they interact and the patterns of sleep and wakefulness that they have. So how this depicts a lot of how they interact with the adults in their lives. As you'll see on this figure, the parts that have a pink shade to them, this is when a newborn is or when a child is likely to be sleeping. The curve there is when an adult, or so the sleep and wakefulness cycle here is depicted. So you can see newborn at that top one, that top line. They are generally sleeping at most for 3 or 4 hours at a time, but they sleep 16 hours a day. So they're asleep a lot, but for shorter periods of time. In and of itself, that is not a problem, except for that matches quite poorly up with the adult sleep cycle at the very bottom of this graph. Also, a thing about crying for infants. When kids are born, their crying is reflexive, and it starts to become a voluntary and purposive kind of form of communication as they go on. One of the findings in extreme cases of neglect is that kids will not cry after a certain amount of time as much because they're used to not having that form of communication be responded to. But this means that initial crying kind of decreases because kids are starting to use it more purposefully. I will not cry if there's no one around to hear me. I will not cry if I have gotten the message that this is not getting me what I want. Okay, some other really cool stuff about infant brains. So the infant brain is almost the same size as an adult brain. If you consider how much the rest of the body grows, right? I said that the head is 70% the size of an adult head at birth. That it cannot be said about the rest of the body. Thank goodness. It'd be really hard to birth things otherwise. But we are born with most of our brain cells. The thing that occurs in the growth of the brain in that first few years is the branching and connections between brain cells. So not so many new brain cells. We do develop new brain cells across the lifespan, but we also are doing a lot more networking and connecting across brain cells in that first year of life. Here is another image that kind of depicts that in terms of the connections between these brain cells being shown as all the little kind of hairs connecting those neurons. Okay, so the real cool thing here is this idea of synaptic pruning. So this is not just an idea, this is a phenomena that has been found time and time again in lots of different studies. So at birth, we have fewer connections between neurons. So the connections between one neuron and another are called a synapse, right? So we have fewer synaptic connections at birth than we do at 1 year old. However, we have fewer connections between brain cells at 10 years old than we do at 1 year old, right? You can see on this graph, there's a dramatic decrease across that first, or after like that first year in the amount of connections between brain cells. The idea here is that as we are going on and experiencing the world, our brain becomes adapted to the kinds of stimulation, the kinds of feedback that we are receiving. So we are used to paying attention to the sounds in a particular language, used to seeing things in a particular spectrum, and our brain becomes really adept at and good at processing that kind of information rather than other kinds of information. We are becoming efficient. We also start working faster, right? The synaptic connections are working faster because they are more efficient. However, there are fewer connections. So an example of this, so here's the same thing I just said in different words. The density of synapses is double what it will be in early adolescence in that first 3 to 12 months. And as a result of this, infants in that 3 to 12 month range are able to establish neural connections more readily than we are later. This can go back to some of the things we talked about last week in terms of the sensitive periods or critical periods, right? So when it is too late to have made a particular developmental milestone, right? It is easier to make certain connections between neurons at this stage than it is later. And the synapses that are regularly used flourish and are strengthened, whereas those that are unused gradually are pruned away, they atrophy and die off. That is from Lightfoot, Cole, and Cole. All right, so an example here can be seen in the ways that infants respond to languages not their own. So languages that they are not used to hearing in the womb or not used to hearing in the parents around them right after birth. So you can see across the x-axis down there, increasing age from left to right, and then how many kids are responding to these different languages. So in blue is Hindi, and in yellow is Salish. This is a native language to the Pacific Northwest. So kids who are hearing English spoken in their family environments and have heard English while in utero gradually decrease, as you can see with those bars there, in how much they respond to of linguistic markers in those different languages. And then the contrast, those two bars on the far end of the graph are to suggest that if a kid was growing up with parents around them and folks around them speaking Hindi, they of course would be able to distinguish and hear all the sounds of all the different Hindi sounds throughout their first year. So their ability to distinguish important sounds in a language not their own is diminishing as we are pruning neuronal connections, right? But if I was using it, it was important for me going forward, I would keep those connections and I would keep that ability to distinguish sounds in my language. Okay, so some initial ways that infants respond to the world. The first, reflexes. We're not going to spend too much time on this. These reflexes are automatic responses to specific types of stimulation. There are many. Most of our reflexes become voluntary. There are a few, like blinking our eyes for loud noises or if somebody pokes you, that remain reflexes throughout our lives. Emotions we'll talk about a little bit, and temperament we'll also talk about a little bit. Okay, so first of all, there's different ways of thinking about emotion. So one of the ways of thinking about emotion is a baby is feeling the different emotion if adults can regularly and reliably code that that is what the baby is feeling. If anyone of you have ever hung out with babies for a long time, particularly brand new ones, you know that they do this thing that kind of looks like a smile when they fart. Yeah. So that whole judging what somebody is feeling based on what you adults perceive from them doesn't work as well. The way of thinking about emotion that I prefer, because it also connects with what we're interested in terms of cognitive development, is thinking about emotions as a system, right? So in this way, we talk about emotions as having a physiological perspective. This is emotions are a way of being aroused, right, physiologically. With very young infants, one of the things that can happen, again, you may have life experience to back this one up too, is that infants, when they are aroused, sometimes they get so upset and are just crying, and why I was crying initially is completely gone. I am crying because I'm upset, right? I'm upset and my little face is so scrunched up that it hurts my head, and I have weeped, and now I have this snot thing going on in my nose and mouth, and this is just horrible, and now I'm crying because I'm crying. right? So there's a way that arousal can be self-sustaining, right? It can perpetuate an emotional state. Emotions are also communicative, right? So we talked about crying earlier, that kids who are experiencing environments where people are not responding to their crying will stop or will diminish how much they cry. So emotions are communicative. There's another piece of emotions here that is really important and for thinking about emotion in infants, which is a cognitive appraisal of the situation. Why? I'm uncomfortable, right? So why am I uncomfortable? So the argument here is that some differentiation between different aspects of emotion has to do with that cognitive appraisal. That if I am just uncomfortable, that's not really the same as angry, because angry has to be directed. I am upset at that person or that thing, right? As opposed to I'm just uncomfortable. And then lastly, emotions often motivate action. Okay, so emotions we can see as vocal and facial expressions in infancy and beyond. The first two emotions that we talk about with this thinking about emotions as a system, the first two are contentment and distress. I'm good or I'm not, and that's it. Because those don't require greater cognitive appraisal of the situation. As we are starting to kind of get a little bit more connection between um, uh, cause and effect, starting to notice that certain things precede other things, right? We start to differentiate those emotions out from contentment and distress to anger, sadness, joy, surprise, and fear. This way of thinking about emotions as a system has a really important piece here, and that it helps us to explain what have been called secondary or complex emotions. And for these emotions, you have to have a sense of who you are, right? If I don't see myself as separate from the world around me, if I don't have a sense of self, I don't have, it's impossible for me to feel ashamed, right? If I don't have a separate sense of self. This is how, so the theory goes, right? I also can't be prideful or envious, right? These secondary emotions we will display primarily when an other person, particularly an adult or authority figure, is present. And we also notice that kids who have been greatly mistreated and have, to the extent that it is impaired somewhat, their sense of self, um, they are less expressive in terms of these secondary emotions. Um, so if I regularly don't have control over what happens to my body because I have been abused physically, sexually, etc., right? I regularly don't have um, corporal control over what happens to me, right? I'm less likely to feel embarrassed if I pee my pants because I'm not mine. Yeah, that's really dark, I know. But this helps to explain some of the reactions of kids who have been through extreme abuse like this, right? And people have also argued that these secondary emotions help kids to acquire societal values. Why do you not pick your nose in front of people? Well, because you were taught early on to be ashamed of doing that, right? Um, so this helps to maintain social norms. Okay. Um, the other thing to say about emotional development is that expression and experience of emotion are related. They're not necessarily directly correlated, but they are related. And the expression of emotion varies dramatically across cultural contexts. So even in infants as young as 6 months old, um, the US, Chinese, and Japanese infants are markedly different in terms of their emotional expression. Chinese infants were found by Campos to be dramatically less emotionally expressive than U.S. infants, and Japanese infants were somewhere in between. Um, U.S. parents tend to praise and seek out expression in their children, whereas Chinese parents, parent is doing really good. The best mom or a dad can do is if that kid never expresses their emotion, never cries, never makes a peep, never smiles, because they have all of their needs met and don't need to cry to get what they need, right? So that's very different than US parents that may be trying to get kids to react, right? All right. So we're going to end this first part here, and then we'll start in on temperament, and then we'll talk about attachment in the next video.